Imagine a 7-year-old boy living with his family in a public housing project in Brooklyn. There was no wealthy father waiting to give him a business. There was no family fortune. There was no famous name. His name was Howard Schultz, and one event from his childhood would stay with him for the rest of his life. Howard was born in Brooklyn, New York, in 1953. His father, Fred Schultz, worked ordinary, physically demanding jobs, including driving a truck. Howard's family lived with financial insecurity, and he grew up in public housing. Northern Michigan University describes Schultz as a first-generation college student who grew up in a Brooklyn housing project and watched his parents struggle financially. The day his father came home injured. When Howard was only 7 years old, his father was working as a delivery driver. One winter day, Fred Schultz slipped on ice while working and injured his foot. But the injury itself wasn't what Howard remembered most. His father had no health insurance, no workers' compensation, and no financial safety net. According to Schultz's own account, his father was dismissed from the job after getting hurt. His mother was 7 months pregnant at the time. Suddenly, the family had lost its income. Howard was just a child. But he watched what happened to his father. A working man could give everything to a company and, the moment he could no longer work, be left with almost nothing. Years later, Schultz repeatedly described this as one of the defining experiences of his life. And something began forming in the boy's mind. If he ever ran a company, he wanted workers to be treated differently. That childhood memory would eventually become part of the philosophy behind Starbucks. He wanted to escape the life around him. Howard grew up surrounded by families who were struggling to make ends meet. Sports became one of his outlets. Eventually, he left Brooklyn to attend Northern Michigan University, becoming the first generation of his family to attend college. He earned a bachelor's degree in communications in 1975. But there was still no Starbucks waiting for him. He wasn't graduating as the heir to a company. He had to find ordinary work. Schultz eventually became a salesman for Xerox. Later he worked for Hammerplast, a company that sold kitchen equipment and coffee-making products. And that seemingly ordinary sales job changed his life. A strange little coffee company in Seattle. While working at Hammerplast, Schultz noticed that one small company in Seattle was purchasing an unusual number of coffee equipment products. The company was called Starbucks. At this point, Starbucks was nothing like the Starbucks we recognize today. The original Starbucks had been created in Seattle in 1971 by Jerry Baldwin, Gordon Bowker, and Zev Siegl. Their focus was primarily on selling high-quality roasted coffee beans, tea, and coffee equipment, not creating thousands of cafes where people sat drinking lattes. Schultz became fascinated. He traveled to Seattle. He saw something in this little company that others couldn't see. Eventually, in 1982, Starbucks hired him to work in marketing and retail operations. He finally seemed to have found his opportunity. But then came another problem. The idea Starbucks itself didn't want. In 1983, Schultz traveled to Milan, Italy. There he saw Italian espresso bars filled with people talking, meeting friends, and drinking coffee. Coffee wasn't simply something people purchased and took home. The cafe was part of their lives. Schultz returned to Seattle convinced that Starbucks could create something similar in America, a warm neighborhood coffeehouse where customers came not merely to buy beans, but to enjoy espresso and spend time together. Starbucks itself describes the Milan trip as the inspiration behind Schultz's vision for the company's coffeehouse model. There was only one problem. The owners of Starbucks didn't really want to pursue his vision. Their business was coffee beans. Schultz wanted coffeehouses. He tried persuading them. They remained cautious about expanding the idea. Think about how strange this must look today. The concept that eventually made Starbucks famous was, at first, something the existing Starbucks owners were unwilling to pursue aggressively. So Schultz faced a decision. Stay in his comfortable job? Or leave Starbucks and gamble on an idea that his own employers didn't believe in? He left. Rejection after rejection. In 1985, Schultz began trying to raise money for his own Italian-style coffee business, eventually called Illinois Journal. Now came perhaps the greatest business struggle in the Starbucks story. Schultz needed investors. According to the widely reported account of his fundraising effort, he approached 242 potential investors. 217 reportedly turned him down. Imagine hearing, "No." Then another no. Then another. 20 rejections. 50. 100. 200. Most people would start wondering whether everybody else was right. Maybe Americans wouldn't pay premium prices for espresso. Maybe Italian coffeehouse culture wouldn't work in America. Maybe he was throwing away a good career chasing a foolish dream. But Schultz kept looking for people who believed in the idea. Eventually, he raised enough money. And in 1986, the first Illinois Journal coffee bar opened. His idea finally had a home. But the biggest opportunity was still ahead. Then Starbucks came up for sale. Not long afterward, the original Starbucks owners decided to sell the Starbucks retail business. Suddenly Schultz had the chance to buy the very company that had once rejected his coffeehouse vision. But wanting Starbucks and being able to afford Starbucks were two completely different things. Schultz again had to raise money. The purchase price was approximately $3.8 million. In 1987, Schultz and his investors acquired Starbucks. He combined his coffeehouse concept with the Starbucks name and began expanding the company. The poor child from Brooklyn had become the leader of the company whose owners once weren't convinced by his idea. But perhaps the most meaningful part of the story came next. He remembered his father. Success hadn't erased the image of his injured father sitting at home without protection. Schultz wanted Starbucks employees to receive something his father never had. In 1988, Starbucks began providing health benefits to eligible full and part-time employees, something highly unusual in retail at the time. Then in 1991, Starbucks introduced its Bin Stock program, giving eligible employees an opportunity to share in ownership of the company. That is part of the reason Starbucks refers to employees as partners. The connection is powerful. A 7-year-old Howard Schultz watched his father lose his livelihood because there was no safety net. Decades later, when Schultz had the power to decide what kind of company he wanted to build, that childhood memory influenced him. In Schultz's own telling, he wanted Starbucks to care for workers in the way he wished his father's employer had cared for his father. The real lesson of the Starbucks story. The Starbucks story isn't simply a man became rich selling coffee. It is a boy watches his father struggle. He grows up wanting a different future. He leaves home. He becomes a salesman. He discovers a tiny Seattle coffee company. He joins it. He comes up with an idea. His bosses don't believe strongly enough in the idea. So he leaves. He asks investors for money. Most reject him. He continues. He creates his own coffeehouse. Then he buys the company that originally wouldn't pursue his dream. And finally, he uses one of the most painful memories of his childhood to influence how his company treats its workers.